Marcus Thompson had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. After 12 years as a Navy SEAL sniper, with 4 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, he craved something his military service had never offered him: peace. The mountains of Montana called to him like a siren song, promising solitude and healing that no therapist or medication had been able to provide. At 34, Marcus looked older than his years. The desert sun had weathered his face, and countless nights of interrupted sleep had carved permanent lines around his steel-gray eyes. His hands, steady enough to make impossible shots at distances that would make most people dizzy, trembled slightly when he wasn't focused on a task. The doctors called it residual stress. Marcus called it the price of keeping his brothers alive. The property listing had caught his attention during one of his sleepless nights. 1,500 acres of pristine wilderness in the Bitterroot Mountains, complete with a modest cabin, a crystal-clear stream, and more importantly, no neighbors for 20 miles in any direction. The price was steep, but Marcus had been careful with his military pay, and the disability compensation from the shrapnel in his left leg provided a steady income. The real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Susan who clearly wasn't used to clients who spoke in clipped sentences and scanned every room like they expected an ambush, had tried to sell him on the property's potential. "You could subdivide this," she had said, spreading her arms wide as they stood on the cabin's front porch. "Build vacation homes, maybe a hunting lodge. The tourist money up here is incredible." Marcus had simply shaken his head. "I don't want tourists. I want privacy." The purchase had gone through without complications. Marcus paid cash, signed the papers, and found himself the owner of more land than some small towns. The cabin was basic but solid, built in the 1960s by a logger who had understood the value of sturdy construction. 2 bedrooms, a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen that was functional if not fancy, and a bathroom with plumbing that worked more often than not. The first few months had been a revelation. Marcus woke each morning to silence so complete it was almost overwhelming. After years of military bases and urban environments, he established routines that gave structure to his days. Morning runs along the deer trails that crisscrossed his property. Afternoons spent maintaining the cabin and exploring his land. Evenings reading by the fireplace or sitting on the porch listening to the sounds of the mountains settling into night. The wildlife had been cautious at first. Marcus would catch glimpses of white-tailed deer at the edge of clearings, their heads raised and alert before they bounded away into the timber. Elk moved through his property in small herds, following ancient migration routes that his ownership papers couldn't redirect. He saw black bears occasionally, usually at a distance, and found their tracks near the stream, where they came to drink and fish for the small trout that darted through the pools. Mountain lions left their signs too, though Marcus rarely saw them. Their tracks in the soft earth near the water told stories of their passage. Large paws, 4 toes with no claw marks visible, because cats kept their weapons sheathed when walking. These were apex predators, and Marcus respected their place in the ecosystem of his mountain. It was during his 4th month on the property that Marcus first noticed something was wrong. He had been hiking a trail that followed the ridgeline above his cabin when he found the remains. A young elk, maybe 2 years old, lay in a small clearing. At first glance, it looked like a natural death, but Marcus's trained eye caught details that didn't fit. The animal had been shot. A single rifle round had taken it down. But what disturbed Marcus wasn't the kill itself. Hunting was a way of life in Montana, and he had nothing against ethical hunters who took game for food. What bothered him was the waste. Someone had shot this elk and taken only the antlers. The meat, hundreds of pounds of protein that could have fed a family for months, had been left to rot. Marcus examined the scene with the same methodical approach he had once used to analyze enemy positions. The tracks around the carcass told a story. 2 men, based on the different boot prints he found, they had approached from the east, probably following the old logging road that ran along the border of his property. The tracks were several days old, but clear enough to show that both men wore hiking boots with aggressive tread patterns, expensive boots that suggested they weren't local subsistence hunters. The rifle shot had been taken from about 60 yards, based on the angle and the damage to the elk. An easy shot for anyone with basic marksmanship skills. But what told Marcus the most about these trespassers was what they had left behind. Cigarette butts, an empty beer can, and a piece of surveyor's tape tied to a branch near where they had parked. Antler poaching was a growing problem across the West. The antlers, especially from young bulls like this elk, were valuable in certain markets. Ground antler velvet was prized in traditional medicine, and whole antlers were sought after by decorators and collectors, but the practice was devastating to wildlife populations and infuriating to ethical hunters, who understood the importance of taking only what you needed and using everything you took. Marcus spent the rest of the day following the poacher's trail. His years of tracking human targets in Afghanistan had taught him to read sign that most people would never notice. A scuff mark on a rock where someone had slipped slightly. A broken twig at shoulder height where someone had pushed through thick brush. The subtle depression in pine needles where someone had stepped. The trail led to the old logging road, where tire tracks in a muddy section showed that the poachers had used a pickup truck, probably a full-size model based on the wheelbase and the depth of the impressions. They had driven in from the county road, which meant they had probably scouted the area beforehand and knew about the logging road access. That evening, Marcus sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and thought about his options. He could call the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department and report the poaching. The game warden would file a report, maybe even investigate if he had time. But Marcus knew the reality of wildlife law enforcement in Montana. The wardens covered enormous territories with limited resources. Unless they caught poachers in the act, prosecution was unlikely. He could post "no trespassing" signs around his property boundaries. The signs would be legally required for him to pursue charges against trespassers, but they would also advertise the fact that this was private land worth protecting. That might deter some people, but it might also attract others who saw posted land as a challenge. Or he could wait and see if the poachers returned. Something about the surveyor's tape suggested this hadn't been a random opportunity. Professional poachers often marked areas where they had found game, planning to return during different seasons or when conditions were better. The decision was made for him 3 weeks later. Marcus was checking a section of fence line near the northern boundary of his property when he heard the distinctive crack of a rifle shot. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, making it difficult to pinpoint the exact location, but it was definitely somewhere on his land. Marcus moved toward the sound with the silent efficiency that had kept him alive in 2 war zones. He stayed in the timber, using the trees for cover, and moved in a pattern that would bring him downwind of wherever the shot had originated. His years of stalking human targets had taught him patience and the importance of gathering intelligence before making contact. 20 minutes of careful movement brought him to a position where he could observe a small meadow where he had often seen deer grazing in the early morning. 2 men were field dressing a white-tailed deer, working quickly and efficiently. They had brought a plastic tarp to work on and seemed to know exactly what they were doing. Marcus recognized neither man, but their equipment told him everything he needed to know. Both carried expensive rifles with high-end scopes. Their clothing was quality hunting gear, not the budget items that local subsistence hunters typically wore. One man was tall and lean, maybe in his 40s, with the kind of deep tan that came from spending a lot of time outdoors. The other was younger and heavier, probably in his 30s, with a thick black beard and arms covered in tattoos. But it was what they were doing with the deer that confirmed Marcus's suspicions. They weren't processing the meat. Instead, they were removing only specific parts: the antlers, the backstraps, and the tenderloins. The rest of the animal, probably 80% of the usable meat, was being left behind. These weren't hunters feeding their families. They were commercial poachers, taking only the most valuable parts and leaving the rest to waste. Marcus watched them work, memorizing details and making mental notes about their methods and equipment. The men finished their work in about 30 minutes. They loaded their prizes into expensive-looking backpacks and prepared to leave. Marcus could have confronted them then, but 2 factors held him back. First, they were armed, and he wasn't. He had left his sidearm back at the cabin, not expecting to need it for a routine fence check. Second, he wanted to see how they were accessing his property and whether they had accomplices waiting somewhere. He followed them at a distance as they made their way back toward the logging road. They moved with confidence, talking in normal voices and making no effort at stealth. That suggested they either didn't know they were on private property or didn't care. Given the quality of their equipment and their obvious experience, Marcus suspected it was the latter. The logging road was where they had left their vehicle, a late-model Chevrolet pickup with out-of-state plates. Marcus was too far away to read the plates clearly. but he could see they weren't Montana tags. The truck had an expensive-looking camper shell and was equipped with an ATV winch on the front bumper. This was serious equipment for serious poachers. As the truck disappeared down the logging road, Marcus made his decision. These men would be back. Professional poachers didn't abandon productive territory after just a couple of kills. They would return, probably within a few weeks, and when they did, Marcus would be ready. That night, he began making preparations. His first call was to the county sheriff's office, not to report the poaching but to ask about the procedures for citizens' arrests on private property. The deputy who answered his questions was helpful, but cautious. "You can make a citizen's arrest for any felony committed in your presence," the deputy explained. "But you have to be careful about use of force. And you need to call us immediately to take custody of anyone you detain." Marcus's second call was to the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks warden for his district. Game Warden Sarah Mitchell was a 20-year veteran who knew the challenges of patrolling the vast wilderness areas of western Montana. She listened carefully to Marcus's report and asked detailed questions about what he had observed. "You did the right thing by not confronting them," Mitchell told him. "These commercial poaching operations can be dangerous, but if you're willing to help us catch them, we might be able to put together a case that will stick." They arranged a meeting for the following day. Mitchell would come to Marcus's property to examine the evidence and discuss options for catching the poachers if they returned. The game warden arrived early the next morning in a green pickup truck with the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks logo on the doors. Sarah Mitchell was a compact woman in her 40s, with graying brown hair and the kind of weathered hands that came from years of outdoor work. She carried herself with quiet confidence and spoke with the authority of someone who had dealt with every kind of wildlife crime Montana had to offer. Marcus showed her the site where he had found the first elk carcass, pointing out the evidence he had observed and explaining his interpretation of the tracks and other signs. Mitchell nodded approvingly as he spoke. "You've got a good eye for this," she said. "Most people wouldn't have picked up on half of what you noticed." They hiked to the meadow where Marcus had observed the deer poaching. The carcass was still there, now being recycled by the ecosystem as scavengers and decomposers did their work. Mitchell photographed the scene and collected what evidence she could, though both she and Marcus knew that prosecution would be difficult without catching the perpetrators in the act. "The problem with these commercial operations," Mitchell explained as they walked back toward the cabin, "is that they're usually part of larger networks. These guys probably aren't the end users. They're supplying someone else who processes and sells the antlers and choice meat cuts." She pulled out a map of the area and spread it on Marcus's kitchen table. "Your property sits right in the middle of some prime wildlife habitat. The elk migration route runs right through here in the fall, and you've got year-round deer populations. For poachers, this is like having a grocery store in their backyard." Marcus studied the map, noting the access points and the relationship between his property and the surrounding national forest land. "How many other landowners have had problems with poachers?" "More than you might think," Mitchell replied. "But most of them don't notice until the damage is already done, or they notice but don't report it because they figure nothing will happen anyway." They discussed options for dealing with the problem. Mitchell could increase patrols in the area, but her territory covered over 1,000 square miles, and she couldn't be everywhere at once. Trail cameras might help document the poachers' activities, but they would also be vulnerable to theft or vandalism. "What I really need," Mitchell said, "is someone on the ground who can observe and report. Someone with the skills to track these guys and the patience to wait for the right opportunity to catch them." Marcus understood what she was suggesting. His military background made him uniquely qualified to conduct surveillance and gather intelligence. His ownership of the property gave him legal standing to detain trespassers, and his personal motivation to protect his sanctuary provided the commitment necessary for what might be a long and frustrating process. "If I do this," Marcus said, "I want to do it right. No shortcuts, no vigilante justice. Everything by the book." Mitchell smiled. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." They spent the rest of the morning discussing tactics and procedures. Mitchell would provide Marcus with a radio so he could communicate directly with her office. She would also arrange for backup from the county sheriff's department when the time came to make arrests. In return, Marcus would monitor his property for signs of poaching activity and coordinate with Mitchell before taking any action. He would document everything he observed and preserve evidence according to law enforcement standards. As Mitchell prepared to leave, She turned to Marcus with a serious expression. These aren't just casual trespassers we're dealing with. Commercial poaching can involve serious money, and people who make serious money from illegal activities don't always respond reasonably to interference. Are you sure you want to get involved in this? Marcus thought about the wasted elk carcass, about the deer that had been reduced to a few choice cuts while the rest was left to rot. He thought about the other wildlife on his property, and what would happen if the poaching continued unchecked. "I've dealt with dangerous people before," he said quietly. "These poachers picked the wrong mountain to mess with." Marcus established new routines that incorporated surveillance of his property boundaries and the most likely approach routes. He set up observation posts at strategic locations where he could watch for signs of intrusion without being detected himself. His military training served him well in this new mission. The patience required for long-range shooting translated perfectly to surveillance work. The fieldcraft skills he had learned for operating behind enemy lines were just as useful for moving undetected through his own property. Marcus also began upgrading his preparations. He purchased a high-quality spotting scope that would allow him to observe and identify intruders from long distances. He acquired a set of night vision equipment for after-dark surveillance. And, after considerable thought, he retrieved his service pistol from the gun safe and began carrying it again. The weapon felt strange on his hip after months of peaceful mountain life. But the poachers had changed the dynamic on his property. They had brought the possibility of violence to his sanctuary, and Marcus intended to be prepared for whatever that might mean. As September turned to October, the wildlife patterns on Marcus's property began to shift with the changing seasons. The elk were moving toward their winter ranges, following paths their ancestors had used for thousands of years. The deer were feeding heavily, building fat reserves for the harsh mountain winter ahead. And somewhere out there, Marcus knew, the poachers were watching too, waiting for the right moment to return to the mountain they thought belonged to no one. Marcus Thompson was ready for them. October brought the first serious snow to the Bitterroot Mountains, and with it the kind of tracking conditions that made Marcus Thompson's job both easier and more dangerous. Fresh snow revealed every footprint, every tire track, every sign of human passage across his property. But it also meant that his own movements would be just as visible to anyone watching. The call came at 4:30 in the morning. Marcus had been awake for an hour already, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and studying topographic maps by lamplight. The radio Mitchell had given him crackled to life with her voice, urgent but controlled. "Marcus, this is Sarah. We just got a tip about unusual activity on Logging Road 47. That's the access point on your eastern boundary, right?" Marcus was already reaching for his gear. "Confirmed. What kind of activity?" Anonymous caller reported seeing multiple vehicles heading up the road around 3 a.m. Said it looked like they were trying to avoid being seen. "Could be nothing, but it could be our friends coming back," Marcus finished. "I'll check it out." The snow crunched under his boots as Marcus made his way through the pre-dawn darkness toward the logging road. He had memorized every trail on his property over the past months, and he moved through the timber with confident silence despite the challenging conditions. The night vision equipment turned the snowy landscape into a green-tinted world of shadows and shapes. Marcus could see clearly for several hundred yards, far enough to spot anyone moving through the open areas between stands of timber. He reached his observation post, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the logging road and the meadow where he had previously witnessed the deer poaching. Just as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the clouds, the position gave him excellent fields of view while keeping him concealed behind a jumble of granite boulders. Marcus settled in to wait, drawing on patience learned through countless hours of surveillance missions in Afghanistan. Waiting was perhaps the most important skill a sniper could develop. The ability to remain motionless and alert for hours at a time while scanning for targets that might appear for only seconds. The snow continued to fall lightly, just enough to blur distant objects but not enough to seriously impair visibility. Marcus used his spotting scope to systematically scan the areas where he expected the poachers might appear, looking for any sign of movement or color that didn't belong in the natural environment. At 7:15 he found them. 3 men were moving up the deer trail that led from the logging road toward the meadow where the previous poaching had occurred. Marcus recognized 2 of them from his earlier observation. The tall, lean man with the deep tan and the younger, heavier man with the black beard. The third man was new, older, and gray-haired, carrying himself with the kind of authority that suggested he might be running the operation. All three were well-equipped and moved with the confidence of people who had done this many times before. They carried high-end rifles and wore expensive cold-weather hunting gear. But what interested Marcus most was their behavior. They weren't moving like hunters looking for game. They were moving like people going to a specific location for a specific purpose. Marcus keyed his radio, keeping his voice low. "Sarah, this is Marcus. I have 3 subjects moving through my property toward the meadow. Same location as the previous incident." "Copy that. Are they armed?" "Affirmative. All 3 carrying rifles. Moving with purpose toward the area where they've poached before." "Understood. I'm en route with backup from the sheriff's department. ETA approximately 30 minutes. Do not engage unless you have no choice." Marcus acknowledged the transmission and continued his surveillance. The 3 men had reached the meadow and were setting up what looked like a more sophisticated operation than the previous quick kills he had witnessed. The older man was directing the other 2, positioning them at different locations around the meadow. It became clear they were setting up a coordinated hunt, with the younger men acting as drivers to push any deer in the meadow toward the older man's position. This wasn't opportunistic poaching. This was a planned, professional operation designed to maximize their take while minimizing their time on the ground. Marcus recognized the tactical thinking involved and had to admit it was well planned, even if it was completely illegal. The men worked quickly and efficiently. Within 20 minutes of reaching the meadow, they had positioned themselves and were ready to begin their hunt. The older man had taken a position behind a fallen log that would give him clear shots across most of the meadow. The 2 younger men had moved to opposite ends of the open area and were preparing to begin driving any game toward his position. Marcus faced a tactical dilemma. Game Warden Mitchell and the sheriff's backup were still at least 10 minutes away, maybe more depending on road conditions. If the poachers completed their hunt and began leaving before law enforcement arrived, they might escape again. But the bigger problem was what Marcus could see through his spotting scope that the poachers apparently hadn't noticed yet. A small herd of elk, maybe 6 or 7 animals, was bedded down in the timber on the far side of the meadow. The elk hadn't detected the human presence yet, but when the drivers began their push, the animals would likely move directly into the older man's field of fire. Those elk represented hundreds of pounds of meat that would be wasted if the poachers followed their previous pattern. More importantly to Marcus, they were part of the wildlife population he had committed himself to protecting when he bought this property. Marcus made his decision. He would move closer to the poachers' position and attempt to document their activities until law enforcement arrived. If they began shooting, he would intervene to prevent waste and protect the wildlife, even if it meant confronting armed men without backup. Leaving his observation post, Marcus began moving through the timber toward the meadow. The snow made silent movement more challenging, but his military training had included operations in winter conditions. He knew how to move quietly even on snow, using the natural sounds of the forest to mask the unavoidable noise of his passage. The route he chose would bring him to within 100 yards of the older man's position while keeping him concealed in heavy timber. From there, he could observe the entire operation and intervene if necessary. Marcus was halfway to his new position when everything went wrong. The elk herd had detected something, perhaps the scent of one of the drivers moving into position, and began moving toward the meadow. But instead of entering the open area where the older poacher expected them, they angled toward the section of timber where Marcus was approaching. The lead cow elk, an experienced animal who had survived many hunting seasons, sensed something wrong about the situation. She led the herd directly toward Marcus's position, probably intending to circle around whatever threat she had detected and escape through the timber. Marcus found himself directly between the approaching elk and the armed poachers. If he remained in position, the elk would almost certainly detect him and alter their course, potentially exposing his presence to the poachers. If he moved, he risked being seen by either the animals or the men. The decision was made for him when the led cow came around a large pine tree and found herself face-to-face with Marcus at a distance of less than 30 feet. The elk's eyes widened in surprise and she snorted loudly, a sound that would certainly alert every living thing within a quarter mile. The other elk immediately responded to their leader's alarm call, wheeling away from Marcus and bolting directly into the meadow where the poachers were waiting. The older man's rifle cracked almost immediately, followed by 2 more shots in rapid succession. Through the trees, Marcus could see elk running across the meadow while the 3 poachers fired repeatedly. The sound of gunshots echoed off the canyon walls, creating a chaos of noise that would have been terrifying to anyone unfamiliar with combat. Marcus moved quickly toward the meadow, knowing that the shooting would end soon, and the poachers would begin field dressing whatever they had killed. He needed to reach a position where he could intervene before they completed their butchery and escaped. When he reached the edge of the timber, Marcus could see that the poachers had killed 2 elk, a young bull and a mature cow. Both animals lay in the snow while the 3 men approached with knives and plastic tarps. "Beautiful work, gentlemen," the older man was saying as Marcus moved close enough to hear their conversation. "These should bring top dollar from our buyers." "That bull's got maybe a 30-inch spread," the bearded younger man replied. "The velvet alone should be worth $2,000. And the cow's got premium backstrap meat," the third man added. "The restaurant buyers pay premium for wild elk." These weren't subsistence hunters taking game to feed their families. They were commercial poachers operating an illegal business that turned wildlife into cash, while wasting most of what they killed. He keyed his radio one more time. "Sarah, shots fired. 2 elk down, 3 subjects beginning field dressing. I'm moving to intervene." "Negative, Marcus. Wait for backup. We're 5 minutes out." But Marcus was already moving. The poachers had their backs turned as they worked on the elk carcasses, and he could approach to within 50 yards before leaving the cover of the timber. At that range, his voice would carry clearly across the meadow, and he would have clear fields of fire if the situation escalated. Marcus stepped out of the tree line with his pistol drawn but held low, not immediately threatening but ready to engage if necessary. His voice, trained by years of military command, carried clearly across the snow-covered meadow. "Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. You are under arrest for poaching and trespassing on private property." The 3 men froze for a moment. Then the older man slowly stood and turned to face Marcus. His hands were bloody from field dressing the elk, but he showed no sign of panic or surprise. "Well, well," the older man said calmly. "Look what we have here, boys. A wannabe game warden." The bearded man and the 3rd poacher also stood, but Marcus noticed that both kept their rifles within easy reach. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge between arrest and violence. "I am acting under the authority of Game Warden Sarah Mitchell," Marcus announced loud enough for his radio to pick up his words. "You are on private property without permission, and you have illegally killed protected wildlife." The older man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You know what, friend? I think you're out of your depth here. This is a big mountain, and accidents happen to people who stick their noses where they don't belong." It was a clear threat, and Marcus responded by raising his pistol to a ready position. "Step away from your weapons and put your hands where I can see them." "That's not going to happen," the older man replied. "See, we've got business to finish here, and you're interfering with that business." The younger men were slowly moving to flank Marcus, spreading out to divide his attention. It was a tactical movement that told Marcus these men had experience with confrontation and weren't intimidated by the prospect of violence. Marcus had been in similar situations in Afghanistan, facing hostile armed groups who had no intention of surrendering peacefully. The difference was that in Afghanistan, he had operated with backup and under rules of engagement that allowed him to shoot first and ask questions later. Here, on his own property in Montana, the legal and tactical situation was much more complicated. He couldn't shoot unless the poachers presented an immediate threat to his life, but he also couldn't allow them to escape with their illegal kill, or, worse, to return later to continue their operations. "Last warning," Marcus called out. "Drop your weapons and surrender, or I will use force to stop you." The older man's response was to nod slightly to his companions. Marcus recognized the signal immediately and dove for cover behind a fallen log, just as all 3 poachers reached for their rifles. The firefight that followed lasted less than 30 seconds, but seemed to stretch for hours in Marcus's perception. Time slowed the way it always had during combat, allowing him to process information and make tactical decisions with supernatural clarity. The bearded poacher got his rifle up first and fired a shot that splintered the bark inches from Marcus's head. Marcus responded with 2 quick shots that sent the man diving for cover behind one of the elk carcasses. The third poacher tried to flank to the right, but Marcus had anticipated the movement and was ready when the man exposed himself for a shot. Marcus's single round caught the poacher in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into the snow. The older man had taken cover behind a large boulder and was trying to get a clear shot at Marcus's position. "You picked the wrong fight, soldier boy," he shouted across the meadow. "Actually," Marcus replied, adjusting his position to get a better angle on the boulder, "I think you picked the wrong mountain." The sound of approaching vehicles ended the firefight before it could escalate further. Game Warden Mitchell's truck appeared at the edge of the meadow, followed closely by 2 Sheriff's Department vehicles. 6 armed officers deployed from the vehicles and quickly surrounded the remaining poachers. "This is Game Warden Mitchell. Drop your weapons immediately." The older poacher looked around at the ring of officers and seemed to calculate his odds. After a moment that stretched like eternity, he carefully placed his rifle on the ground and raised his hands. The bearded man followed suit, and Marcus emerged from behind his log with his pistol still ready, but pointed safely downward. "One wounded," Marcus called to Mitchell. "Shoulder wound, conscious and breathing." The injured poacher was cursing steadily as one of the deputies applied first aid, but his wound was not life-threatening. The paramedics who arrived a few minutes later confirmed that the bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. As the 3 poachers were loaded into Sheriff's Department vehicles, Game Warden Mitchell approached Marcus with an expression that mixed relief, concern, and professional evaluation. "That was either very brave or very stupid," she said. "I'm not sure which." "Little bit of both, probably," Marcus replied, ejecting the magazine from his pistol and checking the chamber before holstering the weapon. "But I couldn't let them get away with this again." Mitchell nodded toward the 2 dead elk. "Well, we've got them dead to rights on the poaching charges. And with the firearms charges added on, they'll be looking at some serious prison time." "Will it stick?" Marcus asked. "Oh, it'll stick. We have your testimony, physical evidence, and the fact that they shot at a citizen making a legal arrest on private property. The district attorney is going to love this case." As the law enforcement convoy departed with the 3 poachers, Marcus stood alone in the snow-covered meadow with the 2 dead elk. The animals would not be wasted. Mitchell had arranged for the meat to be processed and donated to local food banks, while the antlers would be held as evidence. But for Marcus, the real victory wasn't the arrests or even the prevention of waste. It was the knowledge that his mountain sanctuary was secure, at least for now. The poachers who had violated his privacy and threatened the wildlife he had committed to protecting were facing justice. As he walked back toward his cabin, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving the military: the satisfaction of a mission completed successfully. The mountain was quiet again, and the snow continued to fall, covering the last traces of the morning's violence with a blanket of pristine white. Winter was coming to the Bitterroots, and Marcus Thompson was ready for it. Winter settled over the Bitterroot Mountains like a heavy blanket, transforming Marcus Thompson's sanctuary into a landscape of pristine beauty and brutal challenges. The gunfight with the poachers had occurred in early October, and now, as January winds howled through the pine trees, Marcus found himself dealing with consequences he had never anticipated. The legal proceedings had unfolded exactly as Game Warden Sarah Mitchell had predicted. The 3 poachers, identified as Robert Dutch Kellerman, the older leader, Jake Morrison, the bearded younger man, and Tommy Valdez, the wounded 3rd member, faced a comprehensive list of charges that would keep them in prison for years. The evidence was overwhelming. Marcus's testimony, supported by Mitchell's investigation and the physical evidence at the scene, painted a clear picture of a commercial poaching operation that had been active across multiple states. The rifles seized from the men were matched through ballistics testing to poaching incidents in Wyoming, Idaho, and Washington, suggesting they had been part of a regional network of wildlife criminals. But it was the contents of Dutch Kellerman's cell phone that revealed the true scope of their operation. Text messages and email communications connected the trio to buyers in California who were purchasing elk antler velvet for shipment to Asian markets, where it sold for premium prices as traditional medicine. Other messages detailed sales of premium game meat to high-end restaurants that advertised wild-caught protein to wealthy clientele. The district attorney, an ambitious woman named Catherine Walsh, who had made wildlife crime prosecution a priority during her tenure, used the case as an opportunity to send a message to other potential poachers. During the sentencing hearing in March, she stood before the judge and delivered a statement that would be quoted in hunting magazines and wildlife law enforcement training seminars for years to come. "Your Honor, these defendants represent everything that is wrong with the commercialization of our wildlife resources. They took animals that belonged to all the citizens of Montana and converted them into personal profit, wasting the vast majority of what they killed and showing complete disregard for the ecological balance that sustains our mountain ecosystems." Dutch Kellerman received 8 years in federal prison for violations of the Lacey Act, which prohibited the interstate transportation of illegally taken wildlife. Morrison got 6 years, and Valdez, whose cooperation with investigators helped break open the larger network, received 4 years with the possibility of parole after 2. The sentences were the longest ever handed down for wildlife crimes in Montana, and the case attracted national attention from conservation organizations and hunting groups alike. Marcus found himself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as newspapers and magazines wanted to interview the Navy SEAL who took down a poaching ring. He declined most interview requests but did agree to speak with Montana Outdoors magazine for an article about private landowner involvement in wildlife conservation. The interview, conducted at his cabin on a cold February morning, revealed a man who was still processing the dramatic changes the confrontation had brought to his quiet mountain life. "I didn't buy this property to become a wildlife law enforcement officer," Marcus told the reporter, a veteran outdoor writer named Bill Jameson. "I came here looking for peace, but sometimes peace requires you to fight for it." The article, published in the magazine's spring issue, included photos of Marcus on his property and generated hundreds of letters from readers across the country. Many were from veterans who related to his search for healing in the wilderness. Others were from landowners facing similar wildlife crime problems on their properties. But the most significant letter came from an unexpected source. In late April, as the mountain snow was finally beginning to melt, and the first wildflowers were emerging in the protected valleys, Marcus received a handwritten letter postmarked from the Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge. The letter was from Tommy Valdez, the wounded poacher who had cooperated with investigators. Written in careful script on prison stationery, it was part apology, part explanation, and part plea for understanding. "Mr. Thompson," the letter began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand if you throw this letter away without reading it. But I wanted you to know that what we did on your property was wrong, and I'm sorry for the trouble we caused you. I grew up poor in New Mexico, and when Dutch offered me good money for what seemed like easy work, I didn't think much about the consequences. We told ourselves we were just taking a few animals that nobody would miss from places where nobody lived. I know now how wrong that was. The other inmates here know what we're in for, and most of them think we're idiots for risking prison time over just some deer and elk. But I've been thinking a lot about what you said that day in the meadow, about how we picked the wrong mountain. You were protecting something that mattered to you, and we were just looking for easy money. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that when I get out, I'm going to try to make things right. I've been reading books about wildlife conservation, and there's a program here that teaches job skills for working with conservation organizations. I'm hoping they'll let me apply when my parole comes up. Maybe I can spend the rest of my life trying to undo some of the damage I helped cause. It won't bring back the animals we killed, but it might help protect the ones that are still out there. Respectfully, Tommy Valdez." Marcus read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in the drawer of his kitchen table where he kept important documents. He wasn't ready to forgive the young man, but he respected the apparent sincerity of the apology and the effort it had taken to write it. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities to Marcus's mountain sanctuary. The legal proceedings had attracted attention from wildlife conservation organizations, several of which reached out to discuss partnerships that could help protect wildlife habitat on private lands throughout the region. The Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation offered to help Marcus improve wildlife habitat on his property through their private land habitat programs. The Montana Wildlife Federation wanted to feature his property as an example of private conservation success, and the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership invited him to speak at their annual convention about the role of private landowners in wildlife protection. Marcus was cautious about accepting these offers, remembering his original desire for privacy and solitude. But conversations with Game Warden Mitchell helped him understand that his property could serve as more than just a personal retreat. It could become a model for how private landowners could contribute to regional wildlife conservation. The thing is, Mitchell explained during one of her regular visits to check on how things were going, your property sits right in the middle of a crucial wildlife corridor. The elk migration route, the deer wintering areas, the bear denning habitat. It's all connected, and your land is a key piece of the puzzle. They were sitting on Marcus's front porch on a warm May morning, watching a black bear sow with two cubs, foraging in the meadow below the cabin. The bears showed no fear of humans, suggesting they had learned that this particular piece of mountain was a safe haven. "What you're saying," Marcus said, "is that buying this property to escape from responsibility actually put me right in the middle of a bigger responsibility." Mitchell smiled. "That's one way to look at it. Or you could see it as an opportunity to make a difference on a scale you never imagined." The decision to expand his conservation efforts beyond simply protecting his own property wasn't made all at once. It evolved gradually, as Marcus came to understand the interconnected nature of the mountain ecosystem he had chosen to call home. His first step was accepting the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation's offer to help improve wildlife habitat. The project involved creating small meadows in heavily forested areas, improving water sources, and establishing food plots that would provide nutrition for wildlife during harsh winter months. The work required Marcus to learn new skills and accept help from people whose expertise complemented his military background. Forest ecologists taught him about plant communities and succession patterns. Hydrologists showed him how to create sustainable water developments. Wildlife biologists explained the feeding and movement patterns of the animals he was trying to help. The project also brought people to his property on a regular basis, ending the complete solitude he had originally sought. But Marcus found that he didn't mind the company as much as he had expected. The visitors were uniformly respectful of his privacy and committed to the same conservation goals that had motivated his confrontation with the poachers. Summer brought a surprise visitor that changed Marcus's perspective on his role as a mountain guardian. Dr. Elena Rodriguez was a wildlife researcher from the University of Montana who had been studying elk migration patterns in the Bitterroot Range. She contacted Marcus after reading about his property in a scientific journal article about private land conservation. Dr. Rodriguez was particularly interested in the elk herd that used Marcus's property as part of their seasonal migration route. Her research suggested that private properties like Marcus's were becoming increasingly important as traditional migration corridors were disrupted by development and other human activities. "What you've created here," she told Marcus as they hiked through his property, observing GPS collars on several elk that were part of her study, is essentially a wildlife preserve. These animals are showing patterns of use that suggest they've learned this is a safe place. The research data Dr. Rodriguez shared with Marcus revealed the broader impact of his conservation efforts. The elk herd that used his property had increased in size over the 2 years since he had begun managing the land for wildlife. Deer populations had also grown, and her camera traps had documented species that hadn't been seen in the area for decades. "You've basically created an island of high-quality habitat in a landscape that's becoming increasingly fragmented," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "The effects extend far beyond your property boundaries." The conversation with Dr. Rodriguez sparked an idea that would define the next phase of Marcus's conservation efforts. If his property could serve as a model for private land conservation, why not help other landowners in the region achieve similar results? Working with the Montana Wildlife Federation and the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Marcus helped establish the Bitterroot Private Lands Conservation Initiative. The program provided technical assistance and financial support to private landowners who wanted to improve wildlife habitat on their properties. Marcus's role in the initiative was to serve as a peer mentor, sharing his experiences with other landowners who were considering conservation projects. His military background and the dramatic story of the poacher confrontation gave him credibility with audiences that might have been skeptical of advice from government biologists or environmental organizations. The first workshop Marcus conducted was held at a community center in the town of Stevensville, about 40 miles from his property. 15 local landowners attended, representing properties ranging from small hobby farms to large cattle ranches. Marcus had been nervous about the presentation, unsure whether his message would resonate with an audience of ranchers and farmers who might view conservation as a threat to their livelihoods. But as he told the story of his property and the changes he had seen in wildlife populations, the audience listened with obvious interest. "The thing I learned," Marcus told the group, "is that taking care of the wildlife doesn't mean you can't use your land for other purposes. It just means thinking about how those uses affect the animals that also depend on the same resources." The questions from the audience revealed both genuine interest and practical concerns about the costs and complications of conservation management. Marcus was honest about the challenges he had faced and the mistakes he had made, but he also emphasized the satisfaction that came from seeing positive results. By the end of the evening, 5 landowners had committed to participating in the conservation initiative. Over the following months, that number grew to 12, representing over 8,000 acres of private land in the Bitterroot Valley. The success of the initiative attracted attention from conservation organizations across the West, and Marcus found himself traveling to other states to share his experiences with similar programs. He spoke to ranchers in Wyoming about balancing cattle grazing with wildlife habitat needs. He worked with forest landowners in Idaho to develop timber management practices that benefited wildlife. And he consulted with conservation organizations in Colorado about strategies for engaging private landowners in landscape-scale conservation efforts. Each trip reinforced Marcus's understanding that the confrontation with the poachers had been about more than just protecting his own property. It had been the beginning of a mission that would define the rest of his life. The second anniversary of the poacher confrontation passed quietly. Marcus marked the date by hiking to the meadow where the shooting had occurred, now transformed into a lush wildlife habitat area, where deer and elk grazed peacefully in the early morning hours. As he sat on the fallen log where he had taken cover during the firefight, Marcus reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him from seeking solitude to becoming an advocate for regional conservation. The mountain that had promised him peace had instead given him purpose. Game Warden Sarah Mitchell joined him for the anniversary hike, bringing updates on the continuing legal proceedings against the larger poaching network that Dutch Kellerman's operation had been part of. Federal investigators had identified buyers and suppliers across multiple states, and the case had led to the largest wildlife trafficking prosecution in the history of the American West. "You know," Mitchell said as they watched a bull elk with an impressive rack of antlers graze in the meadow where the confrontation had occurred, "that could have been one of the animals they killed if you hadn't stopped them." Marcus nodded, understanding that she was talking about more than just one elk. The conservation work that had grown out of his confrontation with the poachers had protected habitat for thousands of animals across the region. The workshops and consulting he had done had helped other landowners create safe havens that extended the impact of his efforts far beyond his own property boundaries. Sometimes, Marcus said, the best way to find peace is to fight for something bigger than yourself. As autumn returned to the Bitterroots, bringing with it the elk migration and the spectacular display of changing aspen leaves, Marcus Thompson looked out over his mountain sanctuary with a sense of satisfaction he had never expected to find. The property that had started as an escape from the world had become his way of engaging with it on his own terms. The poachers who had violated his sanctuary were serving their sentences, paying the price for treating Montana's wildlife as a commodity to be exploited. The conservation network that had grown from that confrontation was protecting habitat and wildlife across the region, and Marcus himself had found a new mission that honored both his military service and his love for the wild places that had given him healing. Winter was coming again to the mountains, but Marcus Thompson was ready for it. The mountain had taught him that some things were worth fighting for, and that the best way to protect what you love is to help others learn to love it too. As the snow began to fall again, covering the meadow where justice had been served and conservation had begun, Marcus understood that his real battle was just beginning. But for the first time since leaving the military, he was fighting for something that would last long after he was gone, a legacy of wild places and protected wildlife that would endure for generations of mountain dwellers yet to come.